The clink of crystal echoed in the high-ceilinged dining room like a gunshot. It was not a place for raised voices. Not here, where everything from the Persian rugs to the Italian chandeliers whispered of power and money. Yet there she stood, Aisha, in her plain gray maid's uniform, fingers trembling but eyes steady. She had been invisible in this house for 3 years, tending to silverware polished to a mirror's shine, washing linens that cost more than her monthly wage. Her voice was rarely heard above a whisper. But now, "Sir," she said, her voice carrying across the table, interrupting the booming laughter of her employer and his guests. "Please, shut up." The room froze. One of the guests dropped a fork. A faint gasp broke from the lady of the house. And her boss, a man whose name carried weight in political and financial circles, tilted his head in disbelief. The smile that had been carved into his face just seconds ago, twisted into something darker. No maid spoke to him like that. Not here. Not ever. He leaned forward, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "What did you just say?" Aisha swallowed hard. Her palms were damp. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. But something inside her refused to bend this time. She repeated it, word for word. "Please, shut up." You could almost hear the tension crackle like static. Everyone at the table waited for the explosion. But here's the thing about moments like these. They're not just about courage, they're about timing. And what no one in that room knew was that the reason behind her words would unravel everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and dignity. She didn't know it yet, but that single action was about to flip the entire outcome of her life. Here sits what I want you to notice in that moment. There's a kind of silence that isn't about fear, it's about authority shifting. You can feel it, like the air has changed its weight. We're going to unpack what led to this moment, because the road here is littered with the kind of quiet injustices most people never see until someone refuses to swallow them anymore. But before we get there, remember this: true defiance doesn't come from anger, it comes from clarity. Aisha had instead always been the maid. Back in Lagos, she was a school teacher, respected, purposeful, alive with the joy of shaping young minds. Her classroom walls were decorated with hand-painted maps and motivational quotes she'd copied from library books. Children adored her. Parents trusted her. But when her father's health collapsed and medical bills mounted, teaching could no longer keep food on the table. Her younger brothers were still in school. Her mother's sewing business was barely holding on. She needed more, and fast. So, when her cousin in the States offered to connect her with a good job in a wealthy household, she said yes. The promise was seductive. 6 months of work here, and you still send more money home than you could in 3 years back there. That was 5 years ago. Her employer, Richard Coleman, was a billionaire businessman, the kind of man whose name was on hospitals, art museums, and political campaign checks. To outsiders, he was a philanthropist. To those who worked under him, he was something else entirely. He spoke in a way that reduced people, even those in his inner circle, to furniture in the room. Aisha learned early that the staff were expected to be invisible, to glide through spaces like shadows, anticipating needs without making noise. It wasn't just about cleaning or serving food, it was about serving him. And yet, Aisha did it well, too well, perhaps, because the more competent she proved herself to be, the more tasks he piled on her: housekeeper, personal shopper, dog walker, event server, laundry manager. She rarely had a day off. Still, she endured. She told herself, this is temporary. Endure the disrespect. The money will help your family. But over time, the disrespect became something else. Cruelty masked as humor. Richard had a way of making jokes at the expense of those who couldn't fight back. At dinner parties, he'd mock his driver's accent. He'd tell stories about the help as though they were objects of amusement, not people. And sometimes, those stories were about Aisha. The breaking point began 2 weeks before the moment. Richard was hosting a business dinner for potential investors. They were laughing over wine when he casually mentioned that his maid, sweet girl from Africa, had once confused a salad fork for a dessert fork. He mimicked her voice, exaggerating her Nigerian accent until the table roared with laughter. It wasn't the first time, but that night, something shifted in Aisha. She felt exposed, stripped of her dignity in front of strangers. Later, in the kitchen, she stared at her hands that had washed his dishes, ironed his shirts, scrubbed his marble floors. These hands don't deserve to be laughed at, she thought. But here's the thing about injustice. It rarely explodes all at once. It builds in layers. For weeks after that dinner, Aisha noticed small details she had once ignored. How the house echoed with laughter upstairs while she worked alone in the basement laundry room. How Richard's guests rarely looked her in the eye. How the staff spoke in cautious whispers even when he wasn't home. It was like living in a glass box. You could see the life of the powerful, but you were never part of it. And then came the night of the final dinner, the night she told him to shut up. That evening she was serving roasted lamb to Richard and 3 political allies. She could feel the weight of the conversation, their talk about strategies and image control, but stayed silent, as always. Then, Richard began telling another story. This one was about her. It was crueler than usual, sharper. He described her as naive, almost childlike when she first arrived, mimicking her voice again, then joked about how he'd trained her like one trains a pet. The guests laughed. And for the first time, Aisha felt something break inside her. That's the root cause most people miss. Moments like this aren't just about words spoken in the present, they are the final straw on years of systemic erasure, humiliation, and exploitation. When she told him to shut up, it wasn't an outburst. It was the full weight of 5 years of swallowed dignity, finally surfacing. The sound of their laughter still hung in the air when Richard reached for his wine. The red liquid caught the light, swirling in his crystal glass. He was enjoying himself. Aisha stood beside his chair, hands clasped in front of her apron, staring at the curve of his smile. 5 years of silence pressed against her ribs. She thought of every insult she'd endured, every look that treated her like part of the furniture, every moment she had forced her lips into a polite smile because she needed the paycheck. Her mind flickered to her family back home. Her mother hunched over a sewing machine late into the night, her brothers studying under dim lights, her father still taking small careful steps after the stroke. If she spoke now, she could lose everything. Her visa was tied to this job. Her employer had connections in immigration. And she had seen how easily lives were crushed when the powerful decided to make an example of someone. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure someone could hear it. But beneath the fear, something steadier was rising, a kind of cold, grounded clarity. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Sometimes the moral fork in the road doesn't present itself as a safe and dangerous choice. It sits slow death of your dignity, or risk everything for the chance to breathe. Richard's voice cut through her thoughts. And you know, he continued, I had to train her. She didn't even know what an oyster fork was. He laughed again, tossing the remark toward his guests as if she were invisible. Something in Aisha snapped into focus. Her inner voice, the one she'd kept buried under obedience, said, if I let him finish, I'm telling him my dignity is worth less than his amusement. And here's just this truth. She could have walked away. She could have waited until the guests left, spoken to him privately, tried to salvage her position. That was the safer choice. The one most people in her position would take. But Aisha understood something Richard never imagined she would. Silence, in that moment, would make her complicit in her own erasure. She didn't know it yet, but the strength to speak was not coming from defiance alone. It was coming from a deep, unshakable sense that she mattered, that her story, her voice, her humanity carried weight no amount of money could erase. Her decision crystallized in an instant. She stepped forward, just enough for her voice to cut into the space between his last word and the next burst of laughter. Sir, please, shut up. The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. The ripples reached every corner of the room. For a second, she felt like the air itself was holding its breath. And then as Richard's eyes narrowed, she realized, this was the point of no return. Richard's stare was the kind that could make seasoned executives fumble their words. But Aisha didn't look away. It wasn't set arrogance. It was calculation. Because here sits what nobody in that room knew. For the last 2 years Aisha had been listening. She had mastered the art of invisibility in that house, the kind where people talk freely in front of you because they've decided you don't count. The dining table, the hallway phone calls, the muffled voices behind half-closed doors. She heard more than anyone realized. At first she hadn't thought much about it. It was just the noise of her job. But over time she began to notice patterns. Deals that didn't sound legal. Conversations about donations that were really bribes. Stories of political favors exchanged in the shadows. She didn't record anything. She didn't write things down, but she remembered, word for word. That was her hidden power, a mind like a vault. Psychologists call this latent leverage, information or skill you're not consciously using until a situation demands it. It's the quiet kind of power that feels irrelevant, until it becomes your survival. There was another layer too. Back in Nigeria, before teaching, Aisha had worked briefly at her uncle's small law office. She'd been his assistant, filing documents, drafting letters, sitting in on consultations. She'd learned the basics of how contracts worked, how to spot clauses designed to trap people, how legal language could be twisted. She also learned something even more valuable. The law may be written by the powerful, but the truth, if you can prove it, can still pierce through. Over the years she had applied that knowledge in subtle ways in the Coleman household. She'd ask small, innocent-sounding questions when Richard or his associates spoke about deals. She'd notice dates on envelopes, the names on contracts casually left on the kitchen counter. And though she never confronted him, Her mind was silently weaving a map of his empire's weak points. Richard had no idea. To him, she was just the help. But here's what that moment at the table meant. When she told him to shut up, she wasn't just drawing a line in the sand, she was signaling, without words, I know more than you think. And maybe he felt it. Maybe something in her tone told him, this wasn't just insolence, this was a quiet, dangerous kind of certainty. That's the thing about hidden intelligence. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare, it waits, it watches, and when it surfaces, it does so with precision. Of course hidden power isn't enough on its own. The system fights back, and when it did, it came hard. Because Richard Coleman wasn't the kind of man to let a public challenge slide. Richard didn't shout. That would have been too obvious. Instead he gave a slow, almost theatrical smile, the kind that says, you have no idea what you've just done. Dinner ended without another word between them, but the silence wasn't mercy, it was calculation. By morning, the retaliation had begun. First came the scheduling changes. Her shift suddenly stretched from 10 hours to 14. Last-minute events were added to her workload. She was ordered to hand-wash delicate rugs at midnight. The smallest mistakes, a spoon slightly out of place, a glass not polished to perfection, were met with icy reprimands. Then came the isolation. The other staff, who once exchanged quiet smiles and brief hallway conversations with her, began to avoid her. Richard had a way of making sure everyone knew who was in trouble. No one wanted to be seen siding with the woman who had challenged him. And then came the threat, carefully wrapped in polite language. His personal assistant pulled her aside and said, Mr. Coleman is concerned about your performance lately. Given your immigration status, it's important to maintain harmony here. Aisha knew exactly what that meant. Her visa could be revoked with a single phone call, one accusation of breach of contract, and she could be on a plane back to Nigeria before the month was over. Here's what that moment teaches us. Systemic power doesn't always need to crush you in public. Often it works by making your survival feel conditional on your silence. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. Richard hosted a charity gala at the mansion. Cameras, politicians, celebrities. Aisha was assigned to serve champagne in the main hall. She moved silently between clusters of guests, the crystal flutes trembling slightly in her hand. Then, from across the room she heard his voice. He was telling the story again, the same mocking imitation of her voice, the same training her like a pet joke. Only this time he added something new, a sly remark about her getting too comfortable and forgetting her place. The laughter cut into her like glass. And in that moment, under the chandeliers and the cameras, she felt the weight of the system pressing down, not just on her, but on every person who had ever been told to know their place in the presence of power. She excused herself, stepping into the marble hallway. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the tray. She leaned against the wall, her breath shallow, vision blurring. This was her lowest point, the moment the humiliation and fear almost convinced her to disappear quietly, to keep her head down until she could find another job. But here's the truth about resilience. Sometimes it hides under exhaustion, waiting for a single spark to bring it roaring back. And that spark was about to arrive, from an unexpected place. She was in the kitchen that night, long after the gala ended, scrubbing wine stains out of a white linen tablecloth. Her wrists ached, her eyes burned. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. That's when she heard the voice. It was Mrs. Coleman, Richard's wife, standing quietly in the doorway. They had never spoken more than a few polite sentences, but now, Mrs. Coleman's gaze was softer, almost searching. I heard what he said tonight, she murmured. Aisha froze, unsure if this was a trap. Mrs. Coleman stepped into the light. I've married to that man for 22 years. I know what he's capable of, and I know what you've seen. Aisha's heartbeat quickened. She didn't answer. Mrs. Coleman reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card. A law firm. One Aisha recognized from news stories. They'd represented whistleblowers in high-profile corruption cases. If you ever decide you had enough, she said, placing the card on the counter, call them, don't tell anyone, not even me, just, be smart. And just like that, she was gone. Aisha stared at the card. Her mind flashed back to the years of overheard conversations, the patterns she'd pieced together, the deals she suspected were more than just unethical. She thought about the legal basics she'd learned at her uncle's office, about how to frame a claim, about how documented truth could pierce even the thickest armor of power. For the first time in weeks, she felt her spine straighten. Here's what that moment teaches us. Transformation doesn't always begin with a dramatic speech or a burst of anger. Sometimes it begins in silence. The moment you realize you have a weapon the other side doesn't know you're willing to use. Over the next few days she began to plan. She paid closer attention to the documents left on desks, the snippets of conversation during phone calls. She memorized names, dates, and details. When she could, she discreetly photographed papers with her phone, emailing them to a private password-protected account she'd created. But this wasn't about revenge, it was about leverage. She knew confronting Richard directly would be suicide, but if she could gather enough undeniable proof, she could shift the balance, from servant to someone he had to treat as an equal, if only to protect himself. She also began researching, quietly at the public library, on her rare days off. She learned about employment protections, whistleblower laws, and the exact procedures for filing complaints without tipping off the accused. It was slow, methodical, invisible. And that was exactly the point. Richard still saw her as the obedient maid he could mock at dinner parties. He had no idea she was quietly building a case that could make headlines and dismantle parts of his empire. Her comeback wouldn't be loud at first. It would be a silent climb. The first rule of fighting power, Aisha knew, was simple: never let them see you preparing for the fight. So she played her role perfectly. She served the coffee with a steady hand. She smiled when guests arrived. She even laughed, softly, politely, at Richard's forced jokes. But behind that calm exterior, every day was part of an operation. She timed her cleaning so she'd be in the right rooms when certain phone calls happened. She noticed which contracts Richard kept in his study versus which he locked in his private safe. She learned his patterns, when he left the house for meetings, how long he stayed at the golf club, which days the assistant brought in documents from his other offices. And slowly she began to collect. A flash drive hidden in a hollowed-out book in her quarters. A small encrypted file in her email with photographs of suspicious invoices. Memorized conversations, dates and names, committed to paper in a notebook disguised as a grocery list journal. She also built allies, carefully. One of the drivers, a quiet man named Darrell, had once been let go for refusing to fudge a mileage report. He didn't trust Richard either. Over coffee in the staff break room, Aisha asked small questions, listening more than she spoke. Darrell knew things, small details about where Richard met certain people and what he carried in his briefcase on those days. Piece by piece, the map in her mind sharpened. Here's the strategic truth. Big victories are built on small, disciplined wins. Every tiny move Aisha made was deliberate, not for immediate gratification but for the end game. Weeks passed. Richard's treatment of her didn't improve, but that no longer mattered. Every insult was just more fuel. Every humiliation strengthened her resolve. Then came the day she tested her leverage. Richard was in the study, boasting to a guest about a charity deal that sounded suspiciously like a tax shelter. As Aisha entered to collect the empty glasses, she caught Richard's eye, just for a second, and held it a beat too long. No words, no smile, just a look. A look that said, "I heard every word?" Something flickered in his face, confusion, maybe even unease, before he brushed it off. But Aisha saw it. That was the first crack. She didn't set press, not yet. Because she understood another truth about strategy. When you have the upper hand in the making, you let the other side underestimate you until the exact moment you're ready to show your cards. That moment was coming. And when it came, it would happen in public, the same way he had humiliated her. It happened on a Thursday night, a political fundraiser, hosted at the Coleman's mansion. The guest list read like a power index. Senators, business leaders, media figures, cameras flashed in the marble foyer, waiters in black and white uniforms weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne. Aisha moved among them, calm, steady, invisible as always. Richard was in his element, laughing loudly, shaking hands, telling his signature stories. And then, as if fate had scripted it, he spotted her across the room. He smirked. The smirk that meant you stir, still nothing. And then he began again, the same humiliating story he'd told 100 times, about training his maid. The crowd laughed, some nervously, some without hesitation. The sound echoed in the vaulted room. Aisha Sepp's pulse slowed. Not sped up, slowed, because this was the moment she had prepared for. She stepped forward, close enough for everyone to see her, but not so close that it looked like a confrontation. She carried a small tray with champagne flutes, and something else in her apron pocket. "Sir," she said softly, but with a tone that cut clean through the laughter, "perhaps you should stop." The room went quiet. Richard turned, eyebrows raised. "Oh, and why is that?" His voice dripped with mockery. Aisha reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. She held it between her fingers, steady. "Because," she said, her voice calm, "the people you stir speaking to might be interested in what you stir've been doing with their donations." It was subtle, not an accusation, not a scene, but her eyes stayed locked on his, and in that silence, the weight of her words sank in. Richard's face shifted. just slightly, but enough. Because he knew she wasn't set bluffing. The guests glanced between them, sensing something under the surface. Mrs. Coleman, standing near the fireplace, watched with an unreadable expression. Aisha set the envelope down on the nearby table, deliberately, and stepped back. "Enjoy your evening, sir." She walked away without another word, but the tension she left behind was palpable. Richard didn't tell another joke about her that night. In fact, he barely spoke at all. Later, in the privacy of his study, he would open that envelope and find printed copies of several incriminating documents, contracts, payment records, and a brief, polite note. "There's more where this came from. You will treat me with respect from this day forward." And here sits the power of that moment. Aisha didn't have to destroy him to win. She only had to make it clear that she could. The tables had turned, publicly, morally, strategically. The days after the fundraiser felt different. Richard didn't fire her. That would have been too risky now. Instead, the house took on a strange, brittle quiet. Orders were given with clipped politeness. No more mocking jokes at her expense. No more pet training stories. If Richard spoke to her at all, it was brief and businesslike, a shift so stark that even the other staff noticed. Darrell, the driver, caught her eye one morning, and gave the smallest of nods. It wasn't celebration, it was recognition. He knew something had changed. But the ripple went beyond the staff. At the next dinner party, Mrs. Coleman made a point of introducing Aisha to guests by name, as though she were more than just the help. It was subtle, but deliberate, a signal in a house where every interaction was calculated. A week later, a senator's aide, who had been at the fundraiser, stopped Aisha discreetly as she poured coffee in the library. "I don't know what happened that night," the aide murmured, "but I respect it. If you ever need a door opened, call me." It wasn't a job offer, not yet, but it was a seed, proof that her defiance had been noticed beyond the walls of the mansion. Here, that's what that moment teaches us. When you reclaim your dignity in front of witnesses, you give others permission to rethink the way they participate in the system. As for Richard, his retaliation became careful. Petty inconveniences, yes, a late request for laundry, a nitpick about a table setting, but never again in front of others. And when the law firm Mrs. Coleman had recommended quietly contacted him to clarify a matter involving charitable donations, his demeanor shifted further. Aisha never confirmed whether Mrs. Coleman had made that call, but she suspected it. Her own life didn't become perfect overnight. She still worked long hours. She still missed her family, but something inside her had shifted permanently. She no longer saw herself as trapped. Because now she knew she could survive a confrontation with power and walk away stronger. And in the quiet of her room one night, she began filling out an application for a position at a community legal center in the city. She didn't know if she'd get it, but for the first time in years, she was thinking about what she wanted, not just what she had to endure. Months later, Aisha stood on a subway platform in the city, holding a manila envelope. Inside were her acceptance papers. She'd gotten the job at the community legal center. Her work there would be different, helping immigrants and low-wage workers understand their rights, navigate contracts, and find protection from the very kind of exploitation she'd endured. It wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of the life she'd fought for quietly, step by step. She never exposed Richard publicly, not yet. She didn't need to. The leverage still sat, untouched in a secure place. And he knew it. That silent knowledge was protection enough. When she told her mother about the new job, there was a long pause on the line, followed by her mother's voice, warm, steady, proud. "You stood up for yourself, Aisha, but you also stood up for us." And that's the truth most people miss. When you reclaim your dignity, you don't just change your own life, you shift something in the people who love you, in the people who watch quietly from the sidelines, wondering if they can do the same. Here's what that moment teaches us. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet, unshakable knowledge that you can't be erased, no matter how hard someone tries. If you take anything from Aisha Sip's story, let it be this. Protect your dignity like your survival depends on it, because sometimes it does. Leverage isn't about destroying someone, it's about making sure they can never destroy you. And when you're at your lowest, remember, one well-timed, well-prepared action can flip the entire outcome of your life. Aisha didn't plan to become a strategist of her own liberation, but in the end that's exactly what she became. And so I leave you with this challenge. Think about the moments in your own life where you stayed silent to keep the peace. Ask yourself, was it survival or surrender? And if it was surrender, what would it take to reclaim that ground? Because when you do, you might find, just like Aisha, that the system you thought was unshakable starts to bend. If this story resonated with your values, like, comment, and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded, your voice is not a luxury, it's a weapon.